And now part 2 of my conversation with Mats Ingulstad on the history of deep sea mining.
The one thing that sort of the standard history that everybody knew was sort of the Challenger expedition circumventing the globe and then finding nodules in 1873, and then sort of nothing really happened for a very, very long time relating to the history of the nodules. Eventually, when I started looking into this, what I was trying to figure out is how do people think about the ocean as a source of minerals? Because it's not just the nodules, which at the time it seemed even to Buchanan, the expedition chemist who looked at the nodules, said, well, at the moment, this doesn't look like a very paying proposition, but maybe one time in the future, it might be very important because this is a great source of manganese, and manganese soon after was highly sought after, for instance, in the steelmaking industry, because it acted as deoxidizer and desulfurizer in the steelmaking process. But still, sort of the prospect of going down there and grabbing it and pulling it up from the seafloor seemed very daunting. But in the meantime, there were researchers looking at the mineral composition of the ocean and realizing that, of course, these minerals in the nodules, they come from some place. And also all of the minerals that are washed into the sea, they are dissolved in the seawater. And so there were research endeavors looking into, can you extract valuable minerals from seawater? And for instance, Fritz Haber, the Nobel laureate in chemistry, who also the father of chemical warfare, resolved to pay Germany's war debts by extracting gold from the sea. And also when the US was gearing up its light metals production, magnesium, aluminium, etc., essentially what you need for military aviation, they used seawater as a source of magnesium production. So there's this already before the conversation starts around deep sea mining in the post-war years. There is this tradition or this mindset that the ocean is a source of minerals that we can tap into. And this becomes important in the aftermath of the Second World War, when there is concerns that the best minerals reserves around the world have been depleted by this global conflagration, this historically unprecedented mobilization on a vast scale of resources from around the world. And now we might face another shortfall of minerals, and that was the lesson policymakers had drawn from conflict, is that competition for minerals is a driver of conflict. And so if we want to avoid a new world war a few years into the future, we have to address this issue now. And that was particularly salient with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, which again sent minerals prices skyrocketing, and because the demand for the war industries was so high. And that is when also certain policymakers and researchers started looking to the nodules. They were known, and they had still been investigated by oceanographic researchers. And there's a sort of scientific continuity there between the Challenger expedition and the post-expedition life of research into oceanography that was picked up fairly easily in the 1950s and 1960s, when there was this concern about mineral supplies. And by then, the concern was, for instance, that Germany would run out of nickel for its industries. That was driving also the post-war growth, which was essentially also a part of this political social contract that was made between the state and the citizens in the aftermath of the Second World War, that we will provide a new and better life. We will generate economic growth based on industrialization that everyone will benefit from. So a shortfall of minerals was also a threat to the societal model for peace and political tranquility that was sort of really prevalent in the 1960s and onwards. So there were a lot of factors then driving interest in the nodules going into the 60s and 1970s before this big moment in November 1967. Pardo, as the Swedish Maltese ambassador, went before the UN and said, well, we should declare the deep sea bed common heritage of mankind, also based on the belief that the nodules were so rich and the ocean was so vast that essentially you had a renewable resource. Just this imagery of the renewable minerals resource was, to me, where I sort of started investigating what is the origin of this idea. And it's related to ideas about the ocean being sort of beyond human, of a scale that's beyond sort of human intervention and human impact on the natural environment. And it's so vast that the minerals can be taken out without sort of reducing in any discernible way the amount of minerals available for anybody else. So there are a lot of ideas about the ocean that goes into these projections, saying that, well, we can extract as much minerals as we like, but it will never really jeopardize the long-term supply of minerals from the ocean. And at the same time, there was also these different scientific view of conditions on the seabed, that sort of whatever life is down there is very slow, it's dispersed, and it has no real consequence to us if we start mining down there. And there were even geologists saying that, well, if we produce a lot of debris extracting these minerals, that's perfect. That's great, because we will not sort of kill anything important, and the debris will actually provide the basis for new nodules. So it's a long-term investment in having new parts of debris that can start sort of agglomerate into nodules. So there were a lot of ideas about how the ocean functioned that went into making deep sea mining seem like it's something that will be of great benefit to humanity. And this is also where it goes into the discussions about what should the law of the sea be relating to these minerals. And I think it's really a testament to the salience of deep sea mining as an issue in the 1970s, before it was more or less forgotten in intervening decades. This was the main stumbling block when the constitution for the oceans was being negotiated, revolving on everything from sort of innocent passage for shipping and science and research. All of those issues, deep sea mining was really so salient in the political discourse at the time that it's really hard to understand that until it now has resurfaced as a really, really sort of politically charged issue. And that also revolves around subsequent developments, because after the Law of the Sea Convention was signed and negotiations were over after a very long time, then minerals prices sort of stabilized, or the expected growth in mineral prices, the projections, everyone had been basing their estimates about sort of the need for future minerals of particular kind and how market condition would change, turned out to be wrong. And so instead, along with the turn to the market in the 1980s, and particularly in the 1990s, it seemed like, well, we don't need deep sea mining to supply our industries. And actually, there was a lot of talk about the dematerialization of the economic process. Less and less of GDP growth is tied to resources. We're all going to be influencers and YouTubers in sort of contemporary terms, but sort of this sector of the industry is way more important, and the material basis is not really as relevant because you can get what you need in the marketplace. So it's only really after the year 2000 that this conversation broadly starts changing with the rise of China as an industrial power and Chinese demand for minerals. And then the conflicts between, for instance, Japan, China, the US, and later also the EU in the World Trade Organization about how much right does a state have to control the sale and distribution of its own resources.
And that was, that was kind of 2010 that conversation became salient.
Yeah, so the EU develops its raw materials initiative in 2008 and sort of develops this notion of raw materials diplomacy. It also, the EU then in 2012 is a big believer in blue growth still. So they project in 2012 that by 2020 you will have a large active deep sea mining industry generating worth billions of euros. And so they are a really big promoter of this idea. And this is also the ocean being used as a solution to contemporary political problems. And then what happens is that the political attention to minerals starts growing again because there's more fierce competition. It's not there's a lot of volatility also in the prices for the minerals, so it's hard to develop a consistent response. And for instance, for rare earth minerals, developing the processing facilities you need. Whenever someone is talking about investing in that, there's the charge that China as well now dumping the prices to undercut our venture, while at the same time China is under pressure from other countries to reduce prices or to make it less political. The political economy of minerals goes from this sort of really not prioritized area in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s into gradually more and more salient issue. And sort of looking at this long-term development as a historian, which also sort of ties in with the rediscovery or the resurfacing of deep sea mining as a solution to the concerns about supply security and the prospects of profitable deep sea mining. Sort of fits into this longer historical trajectory that we started out with in this podcast, with sort of events after the First World War and really having a strong and robust role for the state, not just in Norway, but also in many societies that learn that the state can mobilize resources on a grand scale and invest in science, can support industries to cover those kinds of needs in times of crisis. And so there's a correlation between the belief that these kind of activities or ventures can be successful if the state supports it, but the means of enacting or promoting efficient minerals development, that changes quite a bit over time. And you can also see the rise and fall of deep sea mining as sort of running in parallel with these long-term historical trends in minerals management, at least in Western society, but also more globally. So there's a much bigger story that deep sea mining can also help us tell about sort of how we relate to the ocean, but also how we manage our economies and develop our societies.
Well, I guess the two things I picked out of that were most surprising to me was, first of all, this idea of the ocean, of conceptualizing the ocean in terms of abundance. You say that this origin of the resources being the common heritage of mankind wasn't necessarily an idea coming out of scarcity. Like, we only have so many resources left. Now we're going to the last frontier. We really have to share this equitably, but much more of there's so much here, we have to use it in a positive, pro-social global idea. That's feels very different than the conversation right now. Just that distinction between abundance and scarcity in the framing, I think, of the discussion.
And also at that time, abundance was also conceived by some as a threat, because if you're operating a minerals industry on land, if you're a newly independent African country with a mining sector, reliant on exports of manganese or income from copper, having lots of cheap minerals flowing in from the sea, becomes an issue. And so this is also part of the debate about the role of the UN in writing the rules for deep sea mining in the sea more generally, as a part of the discussion of, okay, how can we have more equitable distribution of power in the international system. So there are several countries that see this as problematic, and not just African countries, but Canada is also really concerned about its nickel industry. What will cheap nickel from nodules do to Canada as a producer of minerals? So that also goes into the negotiations of what the International Seabed Authority can do. Can it participate in essentially global cartels to manage minerals prices? Should there be a cap on the amount of minerals you can take out of the sea so you don't disrupt terrestrial or land-based mining markets? Wow. And destroy the livelihoods of people in Canada or Ghana or in Chile reliant on mining revenues. And remember also, these are many of the same countries facing problems of weak states and weak democratic institutions that are trying also to develop a new model of economic and societal development that can sort of support their citizens. And of course, to them, this is an existential threat if you lose out on those export revenues, because you have very few chances of diversifying your economies, even if you want to. And they are in many ways dependent and locked into this role as suppliers of minerals, and then someday they will face competition from a potentially endless, and according to the promoters, it could be rather cheap as well. And one of the reasons it was seen as cheap is because you don't have these resource rent taxes attached to the nodules or deep sea minerals, at least in the political imagination of those promoting the industry and the mining from areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there are many costs that wouldn't be involved in contrast to land-based mining. And so, this is going to be great and cheap and plentiful. There's a threat in that, and also the promise, perhaps, of also a redistribution of economic power. And this is why the negotiations of the law of the sea deal as so much with also deep sea mining.
Well, this idea of abundance as being a threat is also a little bit hard from the mindset of kind of sustainability thinking, and there's so much environmental impact from extraction, and so kind of a free lunch of minerals coming from I guess when you talk about how they thought of the ocean as being essentially a barren place that it was just safe to take from, kind of, I guess it's how we look at space mining now. There's minerals out there that if we could just get them, there would be no downsides to that, and then only upsides because it would shut down mines in Indonesia and Bolivia and places where there's nothing but environmental costs associated, and easy to disregard the social disruption that would come from that.
If for another podcast, it's possible also to look at the parallels and also the influence between the ideas of space mining and regulating access to outer space, and also moon mining that runs in tandem with the development of the law of the sea regime. So it's a complicated story, but they are connected. The inner and outer space are connected, and some envision deep sea mining as a sort of poor man's space mining, because it's the inner space we can access without using these very, very expensive rockets that only the very biggest of states can finance. It's more feasible to develop a deep sea mining industry than your own space complex. So there's that part of the story too. And to some environmentalists, precisely this point of shifting the negative externalities and the destruction associated with land-based mining into the sea seems like, if not a very good idea, at least something worth pursuing, because you can essentially then preserve some of the wilderness areas that would otherwise be affected by mining, which has very long-term negative consequences on land as well. And that also speaks to the current discussion about what are pros and cons of deep sea mining. So if deep sea mining helps in a local area or a regional area like the Norwegian Sea, can help us combat global warming, then surely it must be worth it. And then, of course, one of the challenges with making that argument is about it's a problem of scale, because you have this area and then you want to essentially substitute the damage being done there to the gains being made around the entire world from a phasing out of these resources that you assume will not be excavated if there's Norwegian deep sea mining, that it will supplant rather than come in addition to. And so this is also this is a problem for economists, essentially, too. And it's an old paradox known in economics, that if you reduce the price of an important input factor, like coal, for instance, by using it more efficiently, then the Jevons Paradox, then you will just drive up consumption rather than sort of reduce the overall need for that resource. So I guess you can say that this is also the problem here with the Norwegian debate, that politicians are saying, well, this is for the global greater good, security, and also combating climate change, whereas the gains are so hard to sort of say that there's a clear and certain relationship between mining here and then reducing global warming 10 years down the road, and then sort of having the impacts come in the lead up to 2050 or 2070 or 2100.
Yeah, I would love to find the economist who was working on how to answer that question. Is the Jevons Paradox going to apply here? How do we know whether or not we're going to supplant land-based mining, or are we going to accelerate a fair and equitable transition, or are those of us who can already afford to drive Teslas just going to have Teslas with twice the range? The other thing that this discussion has made me realize is that the story of critical raw materials is so much more historically involved with military and defense than I had kind of realized, as someone who has done supply chain analysis and looked at kind of where the anticipated demand for minerals is going to go. It's very much right now a story of the energy transition. But you're telling me that this story is not only about kind of concerns over having the needed supplies for defense, but even that during times of conflict, defense uses of minerals was one of the main uses of minerals. That these military sectors, have been actual, like, substantial demand sources for mineral in the past. And I feel like this is becoming like, again, this is just like my personal perception of the discussion, but I feel like the national security conceptualizing is now coming to the fore, even in the deep sea mining context, that people are saying a little bit less often we need these minerals for the green transition, and a little bit more often we need these minerals for national security.
I see that discursive shift, if you will. It's certainly ongoing. It also makes sense from a political point of view, and because now with the return of interstate warfare in Europe, we are in a very different position talking about the future also of minerals demands than we were 5 years ago. So this is to be expected, but I think I want to add some nuance to your synopsis of the story, because there was a political perception that the defense requirements, they need to be covered, and we have a potential supply security crisis on our hands. But the assessments of that threat were in part based on price developments in the markets. And actually, if you look at some of the corporations involved in or trying to get into deep sea mining at an early stage, for instance, the Reynolds Metals Company, which had been established as an aluminum producer during the Second World War, and massive government subsidies, they also started looking into deep sea exploration and using aluminum, building a submarine called the Aluminaut, to demonstrate not only sort of the uses of aluminum, but also reflecting a genuine interest in deep sea exploration. And from what I've seen in the papers of the leading officials of that company, they were also trying to entice defense officials, saying that, well, we can find all of these minerals in the deep sea, so you should support us. But the defense establishment was actually rather reluctant to sort of get behind that program and give that company at least the support that they needed. So there's a lot more research that's necessary to do on sort of to what extent the military actually cared that much about deep sea mining. And I guess you could say that's also true of present day and age. But there is the political perception of threat to the military supply, which is important. So politicians think this is stuff we might need for a future war. It's stuff they think the defense sector might want, and that it can also drive them to make decisions that are maybe not that are perhaps a bit hasty and would have merited sort of a longer consideration period before the decisions are made. So trying to look beyond what is market developments and what is the price really indicating. Is it an actual shortage of minerals, or is it a speculation in the markets? Is there anticipation of a conflict or tariffs or whatever? And what is actually a threat to the long-term supply of absolutely necessary minerals for defense and security and societal development? Those are different things, but they're difficult to entangle for politicians and also for a wider audience. And this is why I think we also need more research on the societal side of deep sea mining and what it will impact markets, but also how it will impact societies.
Well, this made me realize I forgot to ask you one of my central questions, and I haven't exactly figured out how to formulate this question well, but the deep sea mining is one case where people are forced to make decisions balancing trade-offs across multiple value categories. You've explained in detail a lot of these value categories. So can you just give your initial thoughts on how we can go about making good decisions when we're comparing between value categories that are not comparable? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And so my answer, and this is more than a bit self-serving, is that this is precisely why we have the humanities and social sciences. Because, as you say, this is a political balancing act, but it's also basically a philosophical question about, so what do we value most in our society? What are the core values we want to protect? What are the main aims of policy? And where are we seeing ourselves heading into the future? And of course, within the narrative framework offered by climate change, we're all heading into a very grim future within a few decades. But I think we should also keep in mind that there are still alternate futures, and we have room for decision making collectively as a society to utilize the knowledge that we have, to invest in better data, but also in having this dialogue between disciplines, but also between researchers and society more broadly. And if I had to answer, how can we do this without having sort of historians and geologists and marine biologists and geologists and private companies sort of yelling at each other in podcasts or in op-eds, which might not be the ideal way of having an enlightened political discourse sort of helping us make good decisions for the future. I would be very happy to contribute to that. But this is deep sea mining. What makes it so fascinating is that it involves so many complex questions across a broad range of disciplines. And it's actually a very interesting sandbox, if you will, for developing solutions or trying new approaches to making good decisions about resource management and political decision making, and dealing with questions like, well, the resource curse or climate change and also supply security. Can we do this in an informed way, given the vast amounts of money that we have available and the very bright and talented people who are sort of scattered around in this industry, different viewpoints, opposing viewpoints, and can we facilitate that dialogue and also involve the politicians and ensure that they are as well informed as they can be? Then, if you can do that within your PhD, then I think you've done us all a magnificent service.
Well, it makes me kind of wonder how you feel, like if you say that deep sea mining is a good test case for the kind of decisions that we're forced to make more and more. How do you feel we're doing? The outcomes of the deep sea mining conversation so far, what does that tell us about our ability to have success?
It's tempting to reply. Sun Lai, I think, was asked about the effects of the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to tell. And what is really clear to me is that if we look at it at the present, and so just today, this discussion has not gotten to the point where we're able to make a good decision. But sort of the optimistic assessment is, for instance, that there seems to be an increasing willingness to do the actual legwork of researching and mapping and gaining a sense of how the deep sea functions prior to making a decision. So that's the optimistic assessment, and give it a few more years and a few more marine biologists on boats together with geologists run by private companies and sort of with peer-reviewed research and also I think we're in a much better place to talk in a way that engenders trust about the risks and gains, but also how we balance the distribution of those risks and gains, because this does not involve only Norway, but it involves a lot of other countries too, because of, well, just the nature of the ocean and the nature of the planet.
Okay, well, that's a great place to leave it. So then 2 final questions. Where would you direct people who are interested in learning more about kind of the history and the details of these topics? Are there any particular sources that you think are worth, for those who want to learn more, that you would point them to? And then, yeah, secondly, where can people follow you and maybe get in touch with you if they have any questions after this episode?
Well, there's just, well, deep sea mining history in and of itself is a rather niche field,
Yeah.
but there's some new work coming out. For instance, there's a German book by Ole Sparrenberg about sort of the German history of deep sea mining, which is fascinating in and of itself. But mostly, so far, there isn't like a book-length treatise on the history of deep sea mining. There are some researchers like Tirsa Meyer who's published on these ideas about fairness regarding oceanic resources, but mostly it's still in journal articles for readers interested in sort of this broader view of the ocean and how it's being mapped and utilized by humans. Helen Rozwadowski has written several books that are very enlightening. and provide also a sense of the ocean in popular culture as a frontier in the political imagination, at least, of Western society. So those would be the places to start, but otherwise this is still, and I should also remind listeners or viewers that sort of this is writing a history of an industry that isn't operational yet.
Right.
So that comes with its own conceptual challenges, because it's a moving target, and sort of the justifications for the industry or the shape of this industry to come is still being determined. And historians like to be able to say, well, this is start from the end point and say, point backwards and say, this is how this all came into being. And of course, it had to look this way, whereas this is still sort of an unfolding history. And that makes it really interesting, but also it means that there's no sort of readily accessible go-to place for stuff on the history of deep sea mining yet. But those who are interested in how this unfolds, they could. We have a project at NTNU called TripleDeep, which is interdisciplinary. It's trying to incorporate some or investigate some of those issues related to interdisciplinarity and also the history of deep sea mining within an interdisciplinary context. So essentially, just reach out and send me an email at my NTNU address. I'm sure you can provide a layover and contact information. And there's also a center at NTNU trying to integrate those societal, economic, biological, geological considerations. But there's a lot of work to be done. It's super exciting. So we'll just have to see how this unfolds in the years to come.
Okay, I'll put links to all of these things in the show notes. And are you on social media? Do you post updates on the history of critical minerals on LinkedIn or?
I'm a historian, so guess. No. So, some historians do, but no, I don't.
Okay, well then, great. Thanks again for your time today, Mats, and I hope that we can follow this conversation up in the future, because I think there's lots more to extract from your knowledge on these topics.
Great being here and talking to you.
I think that was fascinating.